Okay, our last piece on the politics and economy of the 1920s is on the other economy. Prohibition, bootleg alcohol, speakeasies, and organized crime. This is also one of the areas, not just organized crime, but speakeasies, that get become part of popular culture and popular consciousness about the 1920s. And they did exist. All kinds of uh, illegal gin joints and bars and nightclubs. Detroit had over 20,000 illegal drinking establishments at some point in the 20s, and these were called speakeasies. The Treasury Department, which actually was the federal department mainly tasked with attacking and bringing down speakeasies and enforcing the sale and transportation of alcohol, smashed 172,000 stills in 1925 alone. They did quite a bit of work on this, but do you think it really slowed, let alone stopped, alcohol consumption? No, it did not. And we can, I think, pretty much figure out why without even knowing. If people want to do something badly enough, they will. And in fact, making it illegal, I would argue, and some others have, that it may have made it even more attractive. People tend to, even law-abiding citizens, like to do things that are slightly illegal, slightly immoral. They usually don't want to do things that are too immoral. But if this isn't that big of a deal to most people and didn't seem like it, then this makes alcohol even a little more exciting. You're doing something kind of secretly, and there's a certain taboo now attached to it. And of course, this helped to raise the stakes on organized crime, which was led by the Italian mafia at this time, the Five Families in New York City, and eventually spreading to other cities. Al Capone, probably the most famous gangster, mafioso type leader of the 20s. He was from Chicago. His operation was there, but nonetheless he had connections to the New York Five Families. The mafia in the U.S. didn't really become a thing until right about this time. It's during the 20s that the dictator Benito Mussolini took power in Italy, and Mussolini drove the mafia out. It's one of the few advantages of living in a dictatorship, and there are very, very, very few. But a dictator, in a dictatorship, they don't have to go through a court system to crack down on organized crime. They just arrest you and throw you in a dungeon somewhere or execute you, and they're done with you. And so, not surprisingly, when the mafia were no longer welcome and no longer had a future making money through illegal, business operations in Sicily and southern Italy, they hightailed it to the United States, especially New York. Why was it a perfect fit? Because here in a democracy, the rule of law prevailing, they could get lawyers, they could buy judges. The democratic political and legal system was overwhelmingly welcome, at least compared to what they faced under Mussolini in Italy. So it's right around this time that the mafia really becomes a presence in the country, primarily on the East Coast and in the Midwest. Al Capone, as he started sort of rising through the ranks, said, I violate the prohibition law. Sure, who doesn't? Well, plenty of Americans violated the prohibition law, but not so many in the extreme way that Al Capone did. So he put together an organized crime operation in Chicago that brought him $95 million a year. Right, just his operation alone in Chicago brought in $95 million a year, and not all of it was trafficking in bootleg whiskey and gin or whatever else it was, but much of it was. So organized crime was here, would have been here anyway, but this just made it much more big business than it otherwise would have been for the rest of this era. So this is sort of the black market economy that involved a great deal of crime and violence. There's no doubt then that Prohibition itself probably upped the amount of violence, increased the amount of mob-related violence in New York, Chicago, and other places. By the way, there were other mafias. It wasn't just Italians, though they were particularly good at it. There was a Jewish mafia and some others as well. You see some of the main players at the time. Most of those are New Yorkers, except for Al Capone, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Profaci, Lucky Luciano, maybe the most famous at the time, other than Capone. We now get to American society in the 1920s, sort of the second of three parts of our unit, and this is done fairly simply here. I ask, how did social groups fare? And I could have spent time on a lot more of them, but I've just picked out three: women, immigrants, and African Americans. Remember, the idea here is that it's one thing to say that the economy is doing well in any time and place, in this case the 20s in America, by looking at the economic statistics and unemployment rate and GDP, but another way to measure things is to find the most underprivileged groups and see how they're doing in society. And we get, of course, as you would expect, somewhat different viewpoint than if we look at it the way we already have when we looked at the politics and economics. So I've just picked out three groups. I could have picked out others or added some, but we're keeping it simple and it'll make the point. So society in the 20s for women, how did women fare? Well, there was sort of a tension between tradition and change. Remember that women did finally get the vote in at the beginning of this decade with the passage of the 19th Amendment. They had already won the right to vote at the state level, but it was enshrined in the Constitution with that amendment and became, national in 1920. So the women's movement had come a long way and was making some gains, albeit more slowly, in other areas and other reforms, rights for women in other areas besides the vote. But the suffrage victory was a huge one indeed, as I pointed out in an earlier unit. But in some ways, the success of that movement and achieving the right to vote and hold office set back the movement in the 20s and maybe even beyond. Why? Because it was the solidarity of a mass movement that got them the vote in the first place. But once women got the vote, there was a tendency, not necessarily for leaders of the movement, but for women who had been members and participated in marches and demonstrations and whatever else it might have been, pamphleteering, who now thought, well, I don't really need to be involved in the organization. I don't need to be involved in the grassroots mass movement because I have the right to vote. We will all vote. Women will all vote independently, but for the same causes on the same side of issues, much of the time anyway, and we'll get what we want. We'll achieve our rights that we deserve through the ballot box. So there was a tendency to believe this, a somewhat naive tendency, because voting didn't get them everything they wanted, to be sure, and right, it couldn't for any group. Now, is it better to have the vote than not have it? Of course. So this still was a victory for women, but the victory it led, in a sense, the movement to die down for a while, for there to be less sort of urgency. And remember, it was the mass movement that got them the right to vote in the first place. So in that sense, you could say the women's movement, anyway, went dormant for a time, and we might be able to say that it didn't really reawaken until the 60s and the 70s, so possibly a number of decades. That's not to say there was no progress for women whatsoever, and we'll get to that in a minute. There's another way in which we could see stagnation or even sort of a step backwards for women, at least the potential for it was there, and that is something related to what we've already talked about in the rise of advertising in the 1920s. Right? The 20s is the decade where advertising really takes off. I didn't say this in the last segment, but it's odd to say, but I think it's true that the United States economic system and businesses perfected how to produce products in mass before they perfected how to sell them in mass. Because we know the big, huge boom in production came in the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, and it's not until the 1920s here that you could say that the advertising is catching up with it. But a lot of that advertising was targeted at women, and we saw that in the slide on advertising. Right, so two of those three, there's women in all of the pictures, but a lot of this is women, and particularly the center slide, because the new devices and gadgets and technology of the home, vacuum cleaners, as you see here, ovens, etc., etc., those were being sold now through these type of ads to women. Meaning the attempt was to sort of focus on women as the homemakers, which then is promoting, and it's mostly men that dominate this industry, so that's probably the main reason why, but it is essentially using advertising to not just sell products, but to sell a traditional version, or what was at least thought to be a traditional version of home life, which is the wife and mother as homemaker, and so and apparently from the advertising, a woman would be just delighted to stay home all day as long as she had a brand new washer and dryer and vacuum cleaner, because we all know how fun housework is with those kind of gadgets. So that was facetious, by the way, in case you didn't know. So this could be seen as a setback for women's rights as well. That's not to say that women necessarily, bought this. They bought the products for sure, so did their husbands, but that doesn't mean they necessarily bought the idea that it's them, almost exclusively that's supposed to use them. But the main point is that advertising, with regard to sort of women's sort of perceived role in it, was sort of pushing back in a more traditional direction. On the other side, there were some positives. One that stands out is the work of Margaret Sanger, who was a progressive from the previous progressive era, still around, and she's most known for her sort of hard-nosed and long campaign for birth control, which was highly controversial at the time. A lot of religious groups, the Catholic Church and otherwise, were against the use of birth control. So today it's seen as kind of a no-brainer that you use contraception, at least if you don't want to have children, if you're engaged in sexual activity. But it wasn't a no-brainer then. It was a highly controversial issue. In a kind of her saying, "No gods, no masters." She campaigned for this for year after year. Helped organize the first international birth control conference in 1927. Eventually was instrumental and one of the founders of Planned Parenthood. She said, "No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her body. No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother." So this was a women's issue, of course, because the idea, her emphasis is that if women have access to birth control, they have more ability to control what they want to do with their lives, when they want to have kids, when they don't want to have kids. Especially in the 1920s, or this long ago, if a woman got pregnant because they weren't using, her and her husband weren't using contraception, let's say husband and wife were both college students and met in college, but the woman got pregnant because they weren't using contraception, what society would expect of her, what the husband would likely expect, what his family would likely expect, the whole society, friends, the larger community, would be for her to drop out of college and become a housewife and homemaker. Not just temporarily putting her career ambitions on hold, which was why she was likely in college in the first place, but permanently. And that's what usually happened if a woman did get pregnant. She became a homemaker and housewife, whether she wanted to or not. Now, there were some, of course, that resisted this, independent-minded women, but it wasn't the norm. So Sanger is saying with birth control, it gives women more options, more choices to choose the life that they want and not have to alter their plans when they get pregnant, at a time when they don't want to. So this is I think, a significant step for women's rights. It's a transitional one, but the pressure is sort of moving in the direction of birth control becoming, considered mainstream and okay, and would be so going forward. There was also already a push for an equal rights amendment. Alice Paul, we've already talked about, is one of the major women's leaders from the progressive era. It didn't go through. It still hasn't even today. But nonetheless, it does show that there still was plenty of activity for women's rights, but it was definitely less than had been so before the women's movement achieved the right to vote. So the 20s was a sort of checkered decade for women. There were certainly some positives in here, but there's still a lot to be done, a lot of rights that women still don't have. And one specific place that we can see this, there are others, is the issue of women in the workforce during World War I who were taking jobs that men had vacated because they were involved, they were in the service, fighting overseas, and what did happen when they came back. This is also a major issue after World War II as well, which we'll get to, but it was already then. Especially in positions, maybe primarily in positions where women were working in fields where men had dominated before. There wasn't so much of a pressure on women to quit their jobs after the war, go back home, let the men have those jobs in traditional female vocations and professions. So, quoting a good book on the 1920s by David Goldberg, when women tried to maintain their positions in male bastions, they ran into a brick wall. This was best demonstrated in Cleveland, where 173 women fought for more than a year to hold on to jobs as streetcar conductors that they had gained for the first time during the war. The women, anxious to fill the positions with much to offer compared to work in factories, laundries, or restaurants, had evinced a desire to join the Union and had been hired at the same wage rates as men. Union arguments that this was not a suitable job for women appeared to some observers to mask a more basic fear that men would suffer a loss of status if women performed the same jobs as they did. Faced with the determined hostility of the American Federation of Labor and union threats to strike to ensure their firing, the women had no chance of keeping their jobs. Women who had been hired as streetcar conductors in Detroit met the same fate. Even in Kansas City, where the union local proved far more supportive of the women, they were unable to retain their positions, a clear signal that segregation by gender was going to be, in employment, remain unaffected by the temporary wartime changes. So those jobs, at least in previously jobs were previously considered male jobs, women basically weren't allowed to keep them. At least there was so much pressure on them that it wasn't realistic that they could keep them. We now look at how immigrants did. How did they fare in the 1920s? The question, and this one's clear, as is the next one. Again, in the case of women, it's a little more mixed, but we've seen just now that certainly there were plenty of areas of concern for women's rights going forward. But in the case of immigrants, the news was just sort of flat out bad in the 1920s. The Palmer raids, the beginning of the decade, show it. The National Origins Act in the middle, and other acts like it before and after show it as well. The Palmer raids, named after the Attorney General who you see pictured on the right, A. Mitchell Palmer, although most of the organizing and the actual carrying out of the raids was done by his assistant, a guy named J. Edgar Hoover, who later on went on to be the king of the FBI. He was already basically the head of what was becoming known as the FBI, but J. Edgar Hoover became a legendary figure. And when I say king of the FBI, it's because he ran it like it was his own fiefdom, his own kingdom. So Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover carry out these raids at the behest of the U.S. government, and the idea or the thinking was that there's too many radicals in the country, too many socialists, anarchists, communists in the country, and there were some foreign radicals, Italian, German socialists, Russian socialists, and the fear was certainly heightened and was here, to this degree to allow this kind of extreme reaction on the part of the government, partially because, and there's definitely a connection, the timing alone indicates it, between the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917, where the Bolsheviks took power, turned themselves into the Communist Party, and began the first communist government in world history. And so it was feared now that Russian radical socialists, communists were coming over here, or already here, and were going to, rise up against the United States, try to destroy capitalism, either through some sort of insurrection or, through more indirect means. Nonetheless, many Americans, as well as many leaders in the country, saw this with fear and trepidation and looked to do something about it. And the result was the Palmer raids. But anybody that was a foreigner, an immigrant from whatever part of the world, tended to be sort of lumped in with all the others. And so in a sense, at least from some Americans' perspective, a lot of Americans' viewpoint, anybody that spoke with a foreign accent that was a worker in a factory was likely to be a socialist or a communist. And it's true that some were, even though those political parties weren't illegal, and not everybody that was an anarchist or a communist was some sort of bomb-throwing radical. Like we saw a bomb thrown at the Haymarket incident in 1886. Some, foreign communists or socialists were not dangerous people. They weren't breaking the law in any way. But the government feared that they were, and feared that it was about to happen, and this is what resulted in the Palmer raids. This was a series of coordinated strikes, government, law enforcement, basically the FBI, raiding radical socialist union headquarters and radical political third-party headquarters all across the nation on basically the same day, and rounding up hundreds and hundreds of people. They expected to find a whole cache of weapons, guns, because they feared a plot to take over the country. Nationwide, I think they found like 2 handguns. So the fears had certainly been way overblown. It did cause the deportation of quite a few people caught up in this dragnet, whether they deserved it or not. Some of them had done nothing wrong and got deported because there was, again, a climate of fear called, this is, by the way, sometimes referred to as the Red Scare. Red is the color of communism. And that scare happened on the heels of, and largely because of, the Bolshevik or Russian Revolution. One U.S. congressman, in showing his antipathy to the flow of immigrants, said the broken wreckage, he talked of the immigrants themselves as the broken wreckage that is pouring into the lifeblood of America. So there's too many sort of wrecks of human beings, wretches of human beings that are pouring into the lifeblood of America. A pretty strong statement indeed. So all kinds of pressure from nativist organizations and nativist sentiment in the country. Again, from a previous unit, nativism is fear of anger directed at foreigners, wanting the government to stop the flow of immigrants, to deport immigrants, and on and on and on. In 1924, President Coolidge, you see him here, signs the National Origins Act into law, passed by Congress but signed by him. This could be considered the low point of his presidency from almost everybody's point of view today, including my own, mainly because not only did this restrict immigration, it restricted it in a clearly biased and racist way. It established quotas for how many people could get into the country from this or that part of the world based on the percentage of immigrant population that had come from that country in an arbitrary year in the past. And lo and behold, no big surprise, that what it meant then was that thousands of immigrants could still come from Western Europe every year, and a handful from China and other Asian countries, non-European countries. Even Northwestern Europe was favored over Southeastern Europe, so which it's not surprising either, since the Southern and Eastern European immigrants were the newer ones, tended to be thought of more suspiciously than their earlier Northwestern European counterparts, partially because by now the latter had been assimilated largely into American society. So just these two things alone, but there were other immigration bills, show a real, I think, hostility to immigrants and extreme difficulties for them to live prosperously, happily, and continuously in the U.S. By the way, this act, too, National Origins Act, basically shut down immigration as sort of a large, phenomenon for a number of decades. It doesn't get revived until 1965 with another law passed by Congress, signed into law by a different president, which we'll get to later on. But that's about 40 years. So for about 40 years, American openness to immigration, which it's known for, was basically closed off. Another good example of fear of immigrants and foreigners, especially radicals, is the Sacco and Vanzetti case that lasted a number of years right through this decade. Sacco and Vanzetti, as you might have already guessed, were Italian immigrants. Both of them were radicals. They were anarchists and were involved in anarchist radical organizations, and they got accused of a robbery and a murder, which they may have done. There's been lots of studies on this ever since. There are some that think that neither Sacco or Vanzetti were involved. Some think they're both guilty. I know at least one scholar thinks that one of them was clearly guilty and the other one probably not. I forget which one, whether it was Sacco and Vanzetti or Vanzetti. But the circumstances still remain unclear. Even if both of them did do it, and we don't know for sure, we probably never will. One thing is clear, that the justice system certainly failed them. They did not get a fair trial in multiple ways. One of which was the judge, because they appealed their case at every level. But the judge in the first trial, who was known to be anti-radical, kind of anti-immigrant, got himself appointed as judge for their appeals process and trial as well. So you have the same biased judge at every step of the way, sitting in the chair, apparently just waiting to find against them. That's not the way our justice system is supposed to work. So whether they did it or not, it does look overwhelmingly likely that they got convicted more because they were radical foreign anarchist immigrants than the evidence against them in the trial. As Professor Goldberg says, the Sacco and Vanzetti case highlighted the vulnerability of immigrants to nativist and anti-radical causes. The case symbolizes the polarization between defenders and critics of immigrants during the post-war period, meaning post-World War I. They appealed, went all the way to the Supreme Court, They were scheduled to get the death penalty, and there was an international movement to save them from the death sentence and to bring justice all over the world. So this became an international cause célèbre. You can see protests in Trafalgar Square in London in the upper left. But these kind of protests happened all over the world. So the Sacco and Vanzetti case is a good example, a famous example of symbolizing the ways in which immigrants, particularly with a radical political background, were largely becoming persona non grata in the 1920s. Third, and finally, how did African Americans fare in the 1920s? Well, you can probably guess on this one. This is a sadly, tragically consistent theme throughout American history. But African Americans are still subject to the worst forms of discrimination and racism in the country. The Ku Klux Klan had been dormant for a number of decades, not absent entirely, but dormant, came back to life with a fury in the 1920s. So the Ku Klux Klan, and it branched out geographically as well as ethnically and religiously. So there were big chapters in northern states now, not just southern states. In fact, I believe in the 20s, the state that had the largest Klan membership was Indiana, a northern state during the Civil War, not a slaveholding state during the Civil War. So the Ku Klux Klan had a presence on the West Coast, in Oregon, as well. And however, it did branch out in another way too. The Klan became more equal opportunity bigots and racists because though African Americans still took the brunt of their vigilante criminal violent behavior, the Klan also now went after Jews and Catholics and immigrants of different sorts. Any people they considered sort of non-white, non-Christian, were now subject to being harassed, intimidated, harmed, killed by the Klan. But African Americans certainly still got the worst of it. The 20s did see good leadership on the part of African Americans, or at least energetic leadership. W.E.B. Du Bois, you see on the right, certainly was a good leader. Marcus Garvey, a little more arguable on the left, but he certainly energized followers and a lot of African Americans. Not all of them agreed with his approach, but he had quite a bit of a following. He preached black pride, African nationalism, and racial separatism. And it wasn't just because of him that this concept was sort of growing more popular in the African American community, but a lot of it was at the time. He later actually went to prison for fraud, prosecuted by the federal government. There's still a lot of question marks about whether he was really guilty or that he was framed for, he's considered a radical presence. So it's possible, but unclear. The 20s was a difficult decade for African Americans. Lots of race riots, lynchings were done in large numbers still. So 76 lynchings alone in 1919, 25 race riots in 1920, hundreds killed and wounded overall. So the same type of grotesque violence and discrimination happened to Americans all over the country, New York City and everywhere else. African Americans had a tough time getting jobs, getting decent housing, without discrimination and racism getting in the way. W.E.B. Du Bois, by this time, was the editor of the main organ of the NAACP, The Crisis, its magazine or paper. And Du Bois, we know, was an eloquent scholar, writer, political activist, but his voice took on, I think, even a greater authority once he started editing the Crisis. So his leadership, along with other African American leaders in the NAACP and other organizations, was slowly, gradually starting to make a difference. Not in a noticeable way, but noticeable to us now in retrospect, in hindsight. Du Bois himself saying, "I was determined that the black man would not continue to be kicked about by all the other races and nations of the world." Taking a staunch stance by the 1920s, which he already had been before that. Marcus Garvey saying, "By the God of heaven, we are cowards if we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces," meaning these forces. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. The first one was Garvey. The second one was Du Bois. But they're similar sentiments. So the African-American leadership is, in this decade, is certainly kind of turning up the volume somewhat. Some of that, I think, can be explained by growing frustration on the part of African-Americans after waiting so long, patiently, not always patiently, but by and large patiently, because they're being told more or less decade after decade, just be patient, wait a little longer, and you'll get all of your rights. And by the 1920s now, we are decades after the Civil War, and African Americans are still being deprived of rights, in this way and that way and the other. A specific example of racial tension and racial animosity towards blacks and African Americans being fed up, understandably, in response, is the Chicago race riot of 1919. There were lots of race riots in this and the next year, but this is sort of the biggest one, the most publicized one. In the end, 23 blacks and 15 whites killed, hundreds injured or assaulted in the process. But this, like riots always do, turned ugly and nasty, and as riots always do as well, even if there's a political point to the riot, and there very well may have been in this case, there's always an element, at least among some participants, of just sheer irrationality that goes into them. The behavior of crowds, is well studied by now, and we know that people behave differently in a crowd than they do individually. In certain circumstances, for certain reasons, they behave differently, and oftentimes in ways that are none too pleasing to have to behold. David Goldberg, yet again, says, in Chicago, tensions had reached the boiling point. Housing and jobs had emerged as the principal areas of conflict, even before the wartime migration, which meant the huge demographic migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. African Americans had been confined to a section of the city known as the Black Belt in Chicago. Restricted in their choice of housing, African Americans, unlike immigrants, had not been able to rent homes close to the factories where they were employed. African Americans often paid exorbitant rents for dilapidated living quarters. By 1918, bombings of homes and attacks on African Americans who dared to try to move into white neighborhoods had become common. So it all reached kind of the boiling point in 1919, and this is the ugly result that you get. So was this a political response out of frustration, for being deprived of rights that were being promised but not delivered on? Yes, but as I said, there's always a certain amount of irrationality in riots, period. Third, and finally, our last segment is on American culture during the 20s, or the Jazz Age. One of its nicknames is the Jazz Age. I've mentioned the Roaring Twenties is another one, but this whole decade is sometimes called the Jazz Age. A reference, of course, to the type of music that was invented by African Americans. certainly not exclusive to African Americans, but really was an original African American creation and form of music. But there are other things about the culture in the 20s that we need to cover as well. This one is of great importance also. And I'm going to start with a specific famous event to talk about something more broad. So the specific event is the Scopes monkey trial that you see here, 1925, right in the middle of the decade. But this is a way to see the larger conflict going on here, what could be called the culture wars of the 1920s. We have culture wars going on right now, and they're somewhat similar. I think the culture wars of the 20s, and if you start with the Scopes monkey trial as sort of a centering mechanism or a point of departure, and move on from there, I think you can see quite a few similarities between the culture wars then and the culture wars now. The monkey trial, which got named by H.L. Mencken, so the Scopes trial was a trial about the teaching of evolution, Darwinian theory, in schools in Tennessee. Tennessee had recently passed a law making it illegal to teach, evolution in schools, and this eventually turned into a nationally publicized, in some ways internationally known trial. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, was looking for a test case to be able to challenge the constitutionality of Tennessee's law in the courts, and it found it in an unknown high school teacher in a small town called Dayton, Tennessee, named John T. Scopes. Scopes didn't even teach biology full time. He did somewhat, but they basically found someone, Scopes, who agreed that evolution should be taught in the schools, and that used a textbook that had a chapter or more on it. And he did, and they told him what they were up to, that he would be, the test for this, and he agreed to do it. So their attempt was on. This probably wouldn't have become so highly publicized and nationally talked about and debated had it not been for the two gentlemen you see on the screen sitting side by side. And this needn't have happened, actually, because the prosecution already had the local lawyers, prosecutors there in place, and the defense of John T. Scopes already had a talented team of lawyers sent by the American Civil Liberties Union. They're the ones who put this whole thing on, but nonetheless, it was seen pretty quickly that this was going to be an important trial, not for criminal reasons, but because of the issues involved, this scientific issues and cultural issues involved. And Clarence Darrow, America's most famous defense attorney, volunteered to be one of the counsel for Scopes and the defense, and a guy we already know about, William Jennings Bryan, the multiple time Democratic candidate for president, who lost every time, did serve as Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson for a time, and had been a congressman from Nebraska before that. But Bryan was in semi-retirement by this time, and his last political crusade was going around the country as a Christian fundamentalist, which he was, and campaigning against, making speeches against the teaching of Darwinian theory or evolution in schools. So he threw his services in, a famous, powerful figure. Darrow was the most famous defense attorney in America at the time, and a very celebrated one. And so, but it's for teaching purposes, for me and for you, this is a great place to start to see sort of the larger culture wars of the 1920s, because in many ways you could see this as a conflict between rural America and urban America. Rural America had sort of in the past, and right up until around this time, kind of dictated the values of the country. Good old-fashioned sort of hometown, small town, Main Street values were the dominant ones. by the 1920s, things are shifting, and the cities, urban enclaves, are the areas that are kind of dictating the way that culture happens, at least the mainstream kind of most accepted. And it's undeniable that the rural population of the country was really uncomfortable with the changes, and weren't wild about the city slickers like Clarence Darrow, who had fancy college educations. They lived in cities. They had they supported modernism, philosophy of art and literature, and supported sort of all of the new and scientific technology and everything associated with sort of the world changing in a different direction, the country moving in a new direction, was sort of uncomfortable, if not met with outright hostility from the urban part of the country. And part of the reason this trial makes such a perfect microcosm of that larger struggle is both of these guys are typical, though they're both famous, in that way they're not typical, but they're typical of one side or the other. Darrow, again, a lawyer in Chicago, a very well-educated, not just, he multifaceted individual and intellectual, held discussion groups in his home, and wasn't just other lawyers that were there, but literary figures and political leaders and scientists and intellectuals. And so the type of person that, frankly, rural individuals then and now tend to hate. Right? Kind of a professor type, like me in a sense. And professors aren't particularly popular in many rural areas today. In some ways for good reason, I must say. I don't entirely blame them for thinking of us as a bunch of arrogant elites trying to shove our ideas down their throats and our values down their throats. And that's exactly what the rural population represented by Brian thought, and Brian himself thought. So these guys are both good examples of the difference between urban and rural America. The monkey trial, H.L. Mencken labeled it that, and Mencken's reporting on this was savage to the town of Dayton, Tennessee, where the trial took place, this little kind of rural town. So as Nathan Miller says, the monkey trial brought the struggle between traditionalism, which means the rural interest, and modernism, the urban interest, and between Main Street, rural, and the metropolis, big city, urban, out into the open. So another way to say it, this culture war, mainly divided between urban and rural, had been kind of under the radar, but the monkey trial, especially once these two guys got involved, sort of brought it out into the open. So it's a symbol, and one of the conflicts, more tangible conflicts in this long-term contest about what American values are supposed to be, about. And in the 20s, I think it's also pretty clear looking back, at least with hindsight, that the rural folks were going to lose this debate, and it's the urban that was going to prevail, which they did in the end. I don't mean over this particular case, but I mean in the larger culture wars about what type of values is America going to be based on, at least mainstream values going forward. It was moving in the direction of the city, and it would continue to, and only recently, in the last several years, has there been a backlash where the rural part of the country has sort of stepped up and said, no, we're not taking this any longer. We're not pleased with the way, the direction America is going, dominated by, we could still call urban values. And there's been somewhat of an uprising again, at least a cultural one. And so now the current culture wars. So the two are related to each other then and now. Another major feature of American culture in the 1920s is something known as the Harlem Renaissance. And this was an outpouring of creativity and genius in the arts, music, poetry, literature, novels, etc., that centered in Harlem. in New York City. It wasn't exclusive to Harlem, but Harlem was the place where, kind of like New York City tends to do in general, which concentrates talent and ability and culture. So most of the big names did tend to go to Harlem because it was the place to be. And Harlem in those days, this isn't known by very many people today. Uh, Harlem, by the way, isn't the people are afraid of Harlem, even if, especially if they've never been there before. They think, oh my God, it's just full of crime. And I've been to Harlem before, and I'm sure there are neighborhoods that, are more dangerous than others. But I felt perfectly safe walking the streets there, and it's a very interesting place with a rich history. And in this era, the 1920s, and this would even be true for some time afterwards, it was a pretty thriving place. There were some poor neighborhoods, and there was crime already, but there were some actually really nice neighborhoods as well. It was mostly African Americans that lived there in the 20s, but it does show you something that doesn't get publicized very often. And that is that, and I think it should get talked about more. There were a growing number of economically and professionally successful African Americans and African American middle class. That wasn't just in Harlem, but you can see it in some of the neighborhoods that were extremely, or sort of at least middle class nice during this period. So the Harlem Renaissance, centered in that part of New York City, was a protest movement as much as a literary movement, says Professor Miller. As such, it created a legacy of creativity that served as a beacon to succeeding generations. And there was certainly plenty of literary talent in this movement. Don't get me wrong. Zora Neale Hurston on the left, you see there. If you haven't read Their Eyes Were Watching God, you should. I read it when I was in college. It's a fantastic book. Langston Hughes, just one of the other many talented writers here, poet, as well as other things as well. But a lot of gifted writers that came out of this movement. So Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and on and on and on. Du Bois himself counts. Marcus Garvey does as well. The music maybe is what is most famous today. This still kind of shows up in the popular consciousness of the 20s because jazz, which I already mentioned, was created by African Americans. Eventually became kind of a crossover and mainstream form of music as well. So plenty of whites started doing jazz also, but white people were fascinated with Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance, particularly the music and the nightclubs, which ended up being speakeasies, of course, because if you sold alcohol at a club, and when you have live music, you usually have alcohol. And so some of the famous speakeasies were in Harlem, and whites and blacks alike loved to go there to the Cotton Club and other pretty well-known speakeasies, and sometimes to hear some of the biggest names in African-American jazz and just American jazz play. So music was a big part of this as well. But we're mainly focused here on the literary component of it. And the small little quote there from Miller is saying that though there was a great deal of talent and art for art's own sake here, genius, just done for the sake of producing excellent, brilliant art, music, writing, painting, that there was a political content to this as well. That there was, you could see in this the kind of frustration we talked about when we looked at Marcus Garvey, W. Du Bois, and how African Americans fared in the 1920s. The writers of the Harlem Renaissance, they were also sort of showing signs in their own work that there's a political frustration being built based on African Americans still being deprived of their basic rights. He published, among many things, Langston Hughes published notable books for decades after this, and brilliant ones. But this came pretty early in his career, and this was in the 20s. Both of the terms used here, by the way, just so we're clear, Negro was considered to be the, or perfectly legitimate word. African Americans accepted it as well. Since that's the title of the poem, we say it that way. But it's not, of course, an acceptable term otherwise, really, unless we're quoting. So The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, which was published in the magazine The Nation in 1926. And Hughes says there, the younger Negro or African American artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they're not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. The tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs. If colored people, that word was also an acceptable word in those days. But if black people are pleased with us, we're glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. So this was considered by many African American artists and political activists of the 1920s to be kind of their rallying cry. This poem sort of took on kind of a life of its own. This became kind of like the motto for the growing movement for African American rights, even though Langston Hughes was, again, a literary figure primarily. So this also, by the way, is aimed not just at white people, right? He says if white people are pleased, but he also then says if African Americans are pleased. This is also about how there was a tendency in Harlem and around the country for there even to be a certain discrimination towards people of color who were of darker skin color. That lighter-skinned blacks were often sort of the upper class, or at least saw themselves that way, and looked down upon their darker-skinned brethren. So this poem is partially aimed at that mentality as well as whites in the country. The Debunkers, which is a great term, somebody who debunks something is someone who sort of calls BS and sort of says this is bunk, right? So debunk is to basically say what you're spouting, what you're claiming, what you're throwing around just is not true. So they were usually gifted writers, became well known. In some cases, novelists. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, the most famous today on the list. Sinclair Lewis won the Nobel Prize for Literature, producing many novels, but the two most celebrated, Main Street and Babbitt, you see there, and celebrated for good reason. They're incredible. And the already mentioned H.L. Mencken, who was a journalist and more of an essayist, though he wrote in many forms. And I like this sort of edition of some of his collected works because it's called The Impossible H.L. Mencken. He was in many ways impossible to deal with. As the quote here indicates, this is also from Nathan Miller. The 20s were made to order for Mencken. His intention was to combat chiefly by ridicule American piety, stupidity, tin-pot morality, and cheap chauvinism in all their forms. He railed against the stupidities of democracy, relished the bizarre, and pummeled the Puritans and Prohibitionists. Mencken was idealized by sophisticated young people in revolt against everything their parents held sacred. He was soon the most denounced man in the country, and according to the New York Times, the most powerful private citizen in the United States. So Mencken, with his pen, turned himself into a loved and hated, incredibly controversial figure. Just the picture of him as a young man there sort of bespeaks a certain arrogance, confidence, and arrogance in his part. And he certainly was that. He was overall a conservative, was not wild about American democracy. I'm not saying he was anti-democratic. He wasn't a communist or a fascist, but he certainly wasn't afraid to point out where he thought Americans were stupid. Remember, this is the guy I said earlier who you didn't want him to notice you, because if he did, he was probably going to say something or write something that was scathing criticism and would be witty and funny at that, all at your expense. So this guy had a poison pen when he wanted to. He in the Scopes trial, which he covered, he tore into the small town of Dayton, Tennessee, and the rural side in that case, and the rural side in the larger culture wars. Not surprising, he's a big city journalist in Baltimore and eventually in New York City as well. So he, no doubt was on the modernist sort of urban side of this culture war, and he showed it in his reports on the Scopes trial. Tried to make, it was cruel what he actually did. I'm not supporting it. It was downright cruel, but he did everything he could in the articles he wrote to basically say that the people of Dayton, Tennessee, are sort of living in an earlier century. They're backward. They're essentially sort of barbaric in the way they look at the world, and ignorant to boot. So he didn't tend to hold anything back in his writing at all. However, he was brilliant. He could be cruel, as I just showed you, but he was brilliant at zeroing in on anything that he didn't think made sense in American society, and was unabashed, unafraid to just come out and say it. And he took the criticism for it. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Right, you probably know, have either read or seen the movie or both. The Great Gatsby. The movie was actually better than I thought it was going to be, but there's no substitute for a brilliant book. Fitzgerald, one of the great authors of the 20th century in America, and he wrote certainly much more than The Great Gatsby, but this really was his magnum opus. And many people get caught up in the glitz, which also in some ways romanticizes the 1920s. That wasn't his, I think, primary goal. He was a serious author, but it does glamorize and mythologize to some degree. There are flappers, both in the movie and the book. You kind of see this, and so sometimes I think that gives people that either watch the movie, read the book, a false sense of what's being said here. Fitzgerald was in many ways criticizing American society, and it was a pretty severe critique at that. Wilfred Maclay saying, Fitzgerald's novels are filled with characters, many of whom are displaced Midwesterners, who are filled with nihilism, meaning sort of disdaining all values, and foreboding about the moral consequences of the very prosperity their characters were craving and enjoying. In many ways, Fitzgerald's novels, certainly The Great Gatsby, is criticizing what we could call American capitalist culture and the values that have sort of come about through capitalist culture, through the capitalist system. So American acquisitiveness, Americans focus on material possessions and trying to have more, than their neighbors, and thinking that they're better than their neighbors if they have more things, a bigger house and nicer cars, etc., etc. And so The Great Gatsby, as glamorous as it is a serious book and a serious critique of American society in the 20s. Maybe the only writer that I know of that sort of savages America in the 20s more is the guy in the middle, Sinclair Lewis. Main Street certainly, like Mencken, and we've already seen in a different way, Clarence Darrow, the lawyer, was certainly on the urban side in this cultural cleavage in the 1920s. And Main Street is a novel, fictional characters, but it just tries to lay out what he sees as the backwardness and idiocy and ignorance of rural America. It's not as cruel as Mencken, but it is clear that he's sort of taking that position. Babbitt is a brilliant book, but I must say it wasn't enjoyable to read overall because it's very depressing. Main Street is a bit more lively, in my opinion. The Gatsby is certainly more entertaining than Babbitt. And Babbitt is depressing all the way through, and when you finish the book, you're more depressed than when you're in the middle of it. It's about this is a great example of the writing of literary figures in the 20s. And sometimes I have to interject things that I forgot to point out that are kind of overall sort of umbrella statements about the specifics we're talking about here. But the debunkers are significant for us here because we're trying to get a number of viewpoints and perspectives on the 1920s. And all three of these guys and other debunkers that we're not mentioning had a tendency to see the 1920s in not so positive a light. They didn't, though the Great Gatsby seems to, it really doesn't underneath the surface, and the other two have a great deal of criticism about many aspects of America during the 1920s. So they don't see it as the 20s as so much of a rip-roaring good time, right? The 20s as a wonderful decade, and particularly Babbitt. The main character, George Babbitt, I believe, is a fictional owner of a real estate company. And he's pretty well off. It's a pretty small town or medium-sized town that he has his business in. So he's not a multimillionaire, but he's successful, one of the key business figures in the town, and lives in a nice kind of upper middle class home. He's got a family. They've got nice cars. They have nice everything. He belongs to the country club, but he doesn't even know that he's unhappy with his life, and he's depressed about it. The way the author Lewis sets it up. That he's depressed, but he doesn't know that he's depressed. So he has a gnawing sort of suspicion there's something wrong, but he doesn't know what it is. But what Lewis is getting at is that his life, because of the capitalist society and capitalist culture that he's living in, it's very dull and boring. It's very conformist. There's little creativity, and everyone's sort of trying to keep up with the Joneses. And it's just sort of mind-numbingly dull and boring. And he desperately wants to break out of it, but he doesn't really know it. Until he goes on this retreat into the countryside. I forget for how many days. It's been a while since I've read it. And it's there while kind of looking out over, I don't know, some vista of a cliff into a lake or into the forest. Nature has a way of sort of bringing out sort of speculation and philosophical thinking, especially if you're alone. And so he's doing this, and he comes to the realization, finally, that you already know as the reader, that he's unhappy, and he wants to change his life. He has to change his life because he doesn't want to, spend the rest of his life as miserably unhappy as he is now. So he makes this sort of vague dedication to change his life when he gets home, and it sounds like he's going to do something like, go off and, leave his family and go off and join a monastery and become a monk full-time. He's going to do something truly, radical in getting out of this lifestyle. Whether that would be right or wrong, it doesn't make that clear, but that's the way it sort of comes across. But what's the most depressing part of all this, and this is the way the novel ends, when he comes back from his trip with all these thoughts in his head, instead of following through on it, he kind of puts it off and slowly kind of gets back into his routine as the owner of this successful business and family man, member of the country club, and day after day starts to, without realizing it, sink back into his old habits and depressing, unhappy lifestyle, and never really realizes that he's sort of gone from being unhappy and not realizing it to realizing it, having an epiphany, and then going right back to his old ways. And the novel ends there. And I have to admit I was super surprised that it ended that way. I'm used to depressing endings, but that one was particularly bleak to me. So the Debunkers certainly have something different to say about the 1920s than does the viewpoint that sees it as sort of a rip-roaring good time and everybody's successful and happy and partying and in wonderful shape. They see it as something else. Our last slide here deals with the growing obsession in the country with celebrities. I think we tend to assume that this has always been the case, but partially because of advances in technology or lack of advance of technology. If you go back far enough, some of it wasn't as possible as it is now. Before television, it was harder to get infatuated with celebrities. Before photography, it was even harder. Before radio, it was harder. So technology has played a big role in America's obsession with celebrities. That's continued to grow right up until the present. As Miller says, Americans developed an insatiable hunger for amusement and diversion to fill their newly available leisure time and to help them escape from routine. Newly available leisure time is actually a reference, more or less, to the success of the economy and improvement in way of life for most people. Since if they have leisure time, they must have the means and the money to be able to afford leisure time. If you're not making enough money to even survive, you don't have much free time. You're having to work or try to find a job most of the day, most of the time. So the degree to which Americans are getting into sort of these amusements and diversions, into baseball, into movies. You see Rudolph Valentino, one of the first sort of male movie sex symbols there. On the left, Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy. He became an absolute sensation, and for years, for something that to us today doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But he was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic in a plane, in this plane called the Spirit of St. Louis, which I now believe is at the Smithsonian. People didn't know. I mean, there was no right way to contact him in those days, or him to contact anyone else. So he just went up into the air, left New York, into the fog, over the ocean, and disappeared. And nobody had any idea whether he was alive. And he plopped down outside of Paris. I forget how many hours later it was. Planes flew much slower in those days, so it took quite a bit of time. But everyone worried, and people thought he was dead. But the world basically paid attention. He got a huge hero's welcome from the French. This, I think, again, it sounds like overkill to us. So what? He flew. Okay, he was the first person to do it. All right, I can see why they'd be amused and pleased. But he became a sensation, a national hero, and an ongoing national hero well after this was already done. But I think it has something to do with America's not just growing obsession with celebrities, but Americans sort of seeing technology now doing just incredible things. If we put ourselves in the shoes of someone in the 1920s, this flight across the Atlantic would seem much more impressive. And so it gets back to, I think, also the American dream. Right? Lindbergh chasing a dream, having this lofty goal of using American know-how and technology and science to his advantage to turn himself into a hero. Even though that wasn't, I think, what he had planned to be, a hero, he was nonetheless. Lindbergh becomes a controversial figure, as we'll see in a later unit as well. And he suffered lots of family hardship. The press hounded him forever after this, to the point of making him super unhappy, and his family, stressed out because the press was always there. And the Lindbergh baby, as it became known, their child was kidnapped and killed. And what were very, very bizarre and unclear circumstances for the case was eventually solved. But Americans were fascinated by his sort of hero status and sort of the feat that he pulled off, again, partly because it had something to do with the American dream, and people could see themselves, right, living vicariously through Lindbergh's success and maybe hoping they'd have something similar in terms of success on their own. People getting into sports and baseball, which I am into myself. I can see why. Into the movies, and even gangsters like Capone became celebrities. And people love to pick up the newspaper and read articles about the latest round of violence happening in the mob. So really from the 20s on, Americans have loved celebrities and loved their leisure pastimes, sports, movies, etc. Thank you.